maybe have noticed, sometimes I'm talking about mindfulness and sometimes I'm talking about Buddhism, and which is it? And the answer, of course, is both. I know a lot more about Buddhism than the mindfulness movement, but and in the talk, sometimes I'll be using Buddhist language, sometimes I'll be referring to mindfulness, but most of what I have to say applies to both. And certainly the conclusion, what I'll be coming to at the end, is something that I think is a challenge for the Buddhist tradition and a challenge for the mindfulness movement. So I think that in the end it'll all come together and it won't be an issue. Yeah. What do you say? Shall we have about a 5-minute meditation to let our mind settle? Please take a comfortable position. And it's up to you if you want to leave your screen on or such. Actually, I have a little timer here, so why don't I use that? If I can open it up quickly enough. Let's see. Yeah. So you may want to turn off your screen or not, up to you. But here we go, 5 minutes. I don't know if you could hear the bell. It wasn't very loud, but that's our 5 minutes. Um, I don't know if anybody noticed, but actually I lost connection there in the middle, but I was able to redial. So if that happens again, I'll be able to redial in right quite quickly. Again, just checking in. Everyone hear me okay? Great, great. Um, I'd like to begin by talking about two icebergs, uh, but not real icebergs. In other words, the icebergs I have in mind don't have anything to do with, say, what's happening off the coast of Antarctica or Greenland. Rather, they are metaphors to take advantage of the fact that icebergs, as we know, it's just the top part, maybe the top fifth that's visible, but in fact, it's supported by everything that's going on below. And I think this is a very helpful way of understanding. First of all, this is the first iceberg, our situation today, our collective situation today, by which I mean not just the coronavirus, which I'm not really going to be talking about much, and not even the climate emergency, but rather the whole of our ecological situation. And maybe we need to connect that with some social challenges as well. Um, anyway, at the top of this iceberg is what's now, people no longer talk about global warming so much, at least in English, we say more climate emergency, which I think is a better term for the situation that we're in. Um, I don't want to waste our time talking about how serious that is. Let me just make three quick points that I think we already know. Number one, it seems to be the greatest challenge to human civilization ever, as far as we can tell. I mean, we're all now preoccupied with the coronavirus pandemic, and for good reason. But the reality is, as Weibo was sort of referring to some extent, the ecological crisis in particular is 1,000 or 1,000,000 times more significant and more dangerous. Number one. Number two, what's maybe the most fascinating thing about the climate emergency is that it's not an external threat, but rather something that we're doing to ourselves. Imagine what would happen if, say, alien spaceships came down and started emitting methane and other toxic chemicals into the atmosphere, such as we are doing. How quickly all the world's nations would unite together to fight against that. But the interesting thing is, because we're doing it to ourselves, ironically, it makes it that much more difficult to actually deal with. That's not to deny that, of course, some people are suffering more than others right now, and some people are likewise benefiting more than others from the continual carbon emissions. But nonetheless, as a species, we can't blame any other species for what's going on. And finally, our collective response to the climate emergency remains, if not completely negligible, certainly very far from adequate. And we could spend time looking at the Paris Agreement, but I mean, most ecologists agree that that's not going to take us very far. In other words, we're just not doing what needs to be done, which raises this really essential question: why not? But the overwhelming urgency of the climate emergency, or I suppose we could call it climate breakdown, can divert us from the fact that the climate issue is only part of a much larger ecological crisis. And that's what I'm trying to point to by talking about the iceberg. If the climate emergency is the tip, there's a much larger eco-crisis below it that it's a part of. For example, just consider what's going on to the oceans. It's certainly true that increasing carbon in the atmosphere means that the oceans are absorbing carbon, and they've absorbed the vast majority of the excess heat that's been produced by that carbon so far. Coral reefs are bleaching, and the acidification that carbon causes is decimating the populations of those species at the root or the bottom of the food chain, like plankton and mollusks, right? But in addition to that, as if that isn't serious enough, we are also are told that virtually all the major fishing grounds are either collapsed or are being fished to the absolute maximum. And some studies are predicting actually that the world's oceans will be basically fished out by the year 2048, which, if you think about it, really isn't that far away. At the same time, we also have this huge amount of plastic pollution, which is quite fascinating to me because plastics only became commercially available and widespread around the time that I was born, back in the late 1940s. Prior to that, the oceans, everything was plastic free, and yet within one lifetime, the oceans are full of plastic, right? Uh, Expeditions to the deepest parts of the ocean have discovered that every square meter of the ocean floor, even those inaccessible places, has many plastic particles. And we know there's the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the middle of the Pacific, where due to currents, the plastic tends to accumulate. More plastic than fish by the year 2050. And again, we can't really just blame that on the carbon emissions or the climate crisis. And that's only looking just at the oceans. I mean, even more worrisome, if possible, is the fact that we are now in the middle of what's being called the sixth great extinction event. And the only one caused by a particular species, that is to say us. E.O. Wilson, the well-known Harvard biologist, has estimated that by the end of this century, about half of all plant and animal species on the planet could go extinct, or they'll be so weakened that they will go extinct soon thereafter, right? This is apparently the fastest of all the extinction events in Earth history, again, due to one species, us. And if I can quote another Ivy League professor, Gustav Speth at Yale, half the world's tropical and temperate forests are now gone. The rate of deforestation in the tropics continues at about 1 acre per second and has for decades. Half the planet's wetlands are gone. An estimated 90% of the large predator fish are gone. 75% of marine fisheries overfished or fished to capacity. Half the world's corals gone or seriously threatened. Species disappearing about 1,000 times faster than normal. The planet hasn't seen such a spasm of extinction in 65 million years since the dinosaurs disappeared. Persistent toxic chemicals can now be found by the dozens in essentially each and every one of us. And he concludes, all we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world to our children and grandchildren is to keep doing exactly what we're doing now, with no growth in human population or the world economy. Just continue to generate greenhouse gases at our present rates, and the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. And yet, he says, human activities aren't holding at a steady level. This was back in 2008 when he wrote it. But of course, they're accelerating. They have been accelerating dramatically. Whoa. What do we feel when we acknowledge something like that? And of course, there are many other environmental or ecological issues should be raised. And in addition, maybe we need to look at social and political ones as well, right? Maybe most obviously, the extraordinary and still growing gap between rich and poor, which the coronavirus pandemic has just exposed even more. It's more and more obvious given the different types of medical care that are available to wealthy people and to poor people. Or maybe here I'm just speaking primarily for the US, where it's really exposing with a shock the deficiency of our so-called healthcare system. Actually, we don't have a healthcare system, it's a healthcare industry. And as a result, Although we have barely more than 4% of the world's population, I think we have experienced almost a third of the worldwide deaths so far from coronavirus. Anyway, enough on that. If climate breakdown is the tip of the iceberg, as I said, this larger eco-crisis is below the tip, but still above the waterline. And I think the reason it's so important to emphasize that is otherwise we can fall back into the habit of thinking that if somehow we can just convert quickly enough from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy, then sort of life, civilization can go on as it has so far. And the whole point of this is that what the eco-crisis really points us to, and I'm talking now about the whole of the visible iceberg, is a symptom of a much bigger issue that I think is below the surface. That is to say, what I think all this eco-crisis is exposing is what might be called the predicament of a globalizing situation that has lost its way. I mean, it's really ironic that just at the time when we finally achieved or developed into a truly global civilization, this global civilization seems to be self-destructing. The main reason for which is that our collective preoccupation with never-ending economic growth and consumerism, and I think that's really kind of the main goal, the main focus or preoccupation of the modern world, that our collective preoccupation with this is incompatible with the finite ecosystems of the earth. As Naomi Klein, I think, put it, we have two different systems, right? We have an economic system that has to keep growing if it's not going to collapse. We have the ecosystems of the earth, which basically don't grow much at all. They're pretty much stable. And we can understand the ecological crisis is basically the two of these systems coming into conflict with each other. And as Naomi Klein also says, only one of those systems can be changed. And one way or another will be changed, right? Now, from a Buddhist perspective, a lot of things could be said about why this fixation on growth can't provide the kind of satisfaction that we're seeking from it individually and collectively. But to better understand the relationship between the visible and the below the water parts of the iceberg, the visible and the submerged parts, why it is that this eco-crisis is the product of something even more problematical, I'd like to spend a moment looking at one particularly revealing example of overfishing. That is to say, what the Japanese corporation Mitsubishi is doing with bluefin tuna. That's the species, bluefin tuna. As you may know, Japanese people love sashimi, raw fish, and their favorite is definitely bluefin tuna, which unfortunately often happens to be one of the world's most endangered fish. What's the solution? Well, the Mitsubishi conglomerate, one of the world's largest corporate empires, came up with a rather ingenious response. Basically, what it's done is cornered almost half the world market by buying up as many bluefin tuna as it can, despite the fact that the worldwide population is plummeting toward extinction. And I don't know if they send out their own ships or just buy up whatever becomes available. But basically what they do is they import the tuna into Japan and put it in their special freezers, which keep it at minus 60 degrees. The point being, by freezing it and preserving it, the price in the future will go up even higher, and they will make a huge profit, because as bluefin tuna becomes closer to commercially extinct, due to overfishing by tuna fleets, the value of its stored frozen tuna will become even greater, right? Trying to satisfy the apparently insatiable demand of Japanese people. Maybe I'm not the only one who finds something not just ironic, but sort of immoral or obscene about that, right? The fact that you respond to the fact that it's becoming so rare and difficult by grabbing as much as you can while it's available in order to take advantage of its scarcity later on. And of course, that has the effect of making it more scarce, right? From a narrow economic standpoint, however, this is quite logical or even clever, because the fewer bluefin tuna there are in the ocean, the more valuable that frozen stock becomes. And of course, it's the nature of economic competition that corporations like Mitsubishi are sometimes encouraged or forced to do things like that, right? If they didn't do it, maybe somebody else would. And in fact, they're not the only corporation in Japan doing that. Nonetheless, this points, I think, to a kind of, I don't know what to call it, kind of fundamental perversity in any economic system that devalues the natural world. Devalues the natural world in the sense of treating it as a means to achieve something else, right? I'm reminded here of a poem by Wendell Berry, an American poet, which includes the lines, "There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places." And the point being, by treating the natural world in this way, we are desecrating it, because whatever else sacred may mean, it means not simply seeing, perceiving, using something as a means to something else. In this case, subordinating the natural world, right, the biosphere, to the goal of making money. That is to say, this is the economic system we call capitalism, which has been amazingly creative and beneficial for some of us at least, a source of great freedom and opportunity, but also very problematical, right? Now, we usually take this relationship for granted. That's what capitalism does. It'll use resources, transform them in some way, and then sell them to make a profit. What I want to point out is a kind of weird sort of paradox here that hopefully will make us sort of sit back and reflect on what this really involves for a moment. Starting with the fact that it's really important for us to realize that money in itself is worthless, right? Those pieces of paper in your wallet or those numbers in your bank account, in and of themselves, they have no value whatsoever, right? They only have value because we have a social agreement to exchange them for things of value. In fact, that's legally built into most countries. It's in other words, money is our medium of exchange. And of course, that means we can use it to acquire almost anything we want, anything we desire. And here's the important point, because we usually, in a kind of unreflective way, tend to equate the satisfaction of our desires with happiness. Money itself, a kind of abstraction, nonetheless, it comes to represent, it comes to symbolize happiness or the possibility of happiness. It's not just a medium of exchange. It has this important individual and collective sort of psychological, symbolic value. This symbolism often overshadows, of course, our appreciation of the natural world, which means that we become preoccupied with destroying real wealth. And by real wealth, what do I mean here? I mean a flourishing biosphere with healthy forests and topsoil and rivers and oceans and atmosphere. We become preoccupied with destroying that in the sense of utilizing it, exploiting it as mere resources in order to maximize numbers in bank accounts. In other words, this is the irony. The danger that our economic system encourages, and I see this very much at the base of the iceberg, is that our economic system encourages us to sacrifice everything of real value, that is to say the natural world, for something that in itself has no value whatsoever, that is to say money. Let me say that again. We end up sacrificing everything really valuable for something that in itself has no value whatsoever, that simply has symbolic value. These numbers, these pieces of paper, valuable only because we have this social agreement. Please reflect on that for a moment. Many Buddhist teachings are relevant here, especially the emphasis on interdependence and non-duality, right? I mean, we often distinguish, separate, or dualize ourselves from other people. We pursue our own well-being at the cost of others' well-being. We do this both individually and in a tribal fashion, our particular group, our particular nation. The irony, of course, is that the ecological crisis repudiates this, because it's very clear we're all in this together, or maybe it's even better to say because we're all part of each other, right? I mean, think about it. When China, for example, burns coal, does the pollution generated simply stay above Chinese skies? When Japan has a nuclear meltdown, does the radiation that flows into the ocean, does it simply stay in Japanese coastal waters, or does it get into international waters, right? In fact, you could say the same is true for humankind and the rest of the natural world generally. The fundamental problem, you might say, and I would say, I mean, is by feeling ourselves as separate from the rest of the natural world, what's really significant about that is we understand our well-being is separate from the well-being of the rest of the natural world. And this is a very immediate form of karma, because insofar as ecosystems get sick, we're going to get sick, right? Maybe the coronavirus pandemic demonstrates this better than anything else, right? It shows us how quickly what happens in one place can affect everywhere else. It also shows us too, it just reminds us that our bodies are part of the earth. In fact, there's this amazing statistic, right? We're told that in our bodies, there are more microbes that do not have our DNA, things like viruses and bacteria and so forth. There are more of those in our body than our own cells. And yet we're dependent on them even as they're dependent upon us. So it raises this really interesting question: where does my body end and the rest of the biosphere begin? And we can create a place and we say that's the place, but the reality is there's no clear distinction, right? We're part of this great biospheric cycle. I mean, if you don't understand or don't agree with that, stop breathing for 4 minutes and see what happens, or stop drinking water for a week and see what happens. Right? So what's my conclusion from all of this? That the ecological crisis isn't just a political crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, a scientific crisis. In some sense, it's also a spiritual crisis. I think that we are challenged to realize our interdependence, our larger self with the earth. It's almost as if the earth is telling us, wake up and get out of the way. That's the first iceberg. What about the second iceberg? What's the second iceberg? Buddhism. And perhaps to a pretty large extent, the mindfulness movement as well. This is another iceberg. These are other icebergs because I believe that the ecological crisis and the larger civilizational predicament that they are symptoms of, that ecological crisis, that larger civilizational predicament is just as much a crisis for the Buddhist tradition, which needs to clarify its essential message if it's going to fulfill its potential in the modern world. In other words, I really believe that in response to this extraordinary challenge that we're facing today, Buddhism itself needs to wake up. And those of you who are mindfulness practitioners and teachers, I hope that you'll also ask yourself the same thing about the mindfulness movement. Is it also true for the mindfulness movement? Is this also a challenge for the way that mindfulness has been taught and presented and understood? Are either of these traditions responding adequately, appropriately to the kind of situation that we're facing us, that's facing us now. Here, a lot of what I have to say has particular reference to the United States situation. I really don't know enough about what's happening in Europe, but my guess is that there's a fair amount of overlap. So I want to start the second iceberg and put at the very top of that, corresponding to the climate emergency, the first iceberg, the climate emergency. At the top of the Buddhist iceberg, I want to put eco-dharma, by which I mean those aspects of Buddhist teachings that can help us understand and respond to the ecological crisis. But this, in fact, points to a very interesting problem that we've had in American Buddhism for quite a while. I mean, recently things are picking up, right? I've written a book on eco-dharma that Weibo showed you, and the response has been good. I'm one of the founders of this new ecological center. We have the Rocky Mountain Eco-Dharma Retreat Center here in the mountains above Boulder, where I live. But what's interesting is that both of these are only happening in the last few years. I mean, the ecological crisis has been front page news, at least in the United States, since the 1980s, when James Hansen testified to Congress. And then we had the Earth Summit in Rio way back in 1992, right? Almost 30 years ago. What I find discouraging, puzzling, is why it's taken Buddhists so long to get serious about that, right? For like a decade or so, I was offering workshops and retreats focused on ecological implications of the Dharma. And unfortunately, a number of those had to be canceled, or should have been canceled, because not many people signed up. Other people noticed the same thing. Other Buddhist teachers said that when they announced ahead of time that they were going to give a talk, say, on Buddhism and ecology, guess what? The number of people who came to the talk was less than usual. Interesting. Why? Why so slow? Why has Buddhism has been so tardy in waking up to this? Putting that question on the shelf for a moment, let's go, what's just below this? Again, still the iceberg. The tip is eco-dharma. Below it would be this larger sphere of what might be called socially engaged Buddhism, right? It was interesting that in the wake of the big 2008 recession, the two largest socially engaged Buddhist organizations in the US, Buddhist Peace Fellowship and Zen Peacemakers, they pretty much collapsed, or financial support for them collapsed. They've survived, and now they're doing, they've managed to reorganize, but a lot of the financial situation just wasn't there. Even at the same time when there was a lot of money to create new Dharma centers, right? Spirit Rock raised millions and millions of dollars out in California to create a meditations place. And that's very good. It's a wonderful place to meditate. But I just find it striking. The money is available for that, but money for social engagement just hasn't been there. In a way, it doesn't mean that social engagement for Buddhism has failed. In some degree, it's been kind of a victim of its own success, in the sense that I think it's generally accepted, at least in the US, and you'll have to tell me if this is true in Europe as well. I think it's generally accepted that service, socially engaged Buddhism in the sense of service. What do I mean by service? Helping homeless people, prison dharma, going into prisons, teaching meditation in prisons, hospice work, working with people who are dying. I think it's more and more accepted that this can be a very important part of the Buddhist path. But to put it metaphorically, Buddhists have become much better at pulling drowning people out of the river. You've got this river, people drowning. I think we've become better at pulling them out of the river. But here's the problem. We're not much better at asking, hey, why is it that there are so many people drowning in the river? Who or what is pushing them in the river upstream, right? We're not very good at asking those questions. And in a way, I can understand it. In Buddhism, as in mindfulness, right, we're told to let go of concepts. We're told to let go of ideology and so forth. You know, both Zen, for example, and mindfulness, it's encouraging us to be mindful right here and now, right? Be present, maybe with this homeless person. But it's a lot more difficult to come to grips with abstract issues um, like an economic system that seems to institutionalize greed, right? The Buddha, you know, the Buddha didn't talk about evil. What he talked about were what we sometimes call the three fires or the three poisons. That is to say, basically he said, when what we do is motivated by greed, ill will, and or delusion, then the results tend to be problematic. Sooner or later, they cause suffering. But the way the Buddhist tradition developed in Asia, this was very much understood on the individual level, right? My own dukkha, my own suffering is due to my own karma, due to what I did in past lifetimes. It's very much individual, individual, individual. And I think one of the really important developments in contemporary Buddhism, now that it's spread beyond Asia and it's become truly global, is we're asking very important questions about this. I mean, we're realizing that no, it doesn't work just to say all your suffering is due to your karma. We know too much about social forces, right? We know too much about how people can get caught up in social situations that oppress them, regardless of what they themselves may be doing, right? Look, I mean, if you're a Jewish person living in Nazi Germany in World War II, it doesn't matter how nice a person you may be personally, the chances are very, very likely that you're going to suffer in a number of extreme ways. And I think it's really important for us not to sort of get caught up in this ideology that you must have bad karma in your past lifetime. It's really important for us. Let's stop blaming the victim. And let's acknowledge what's happened in the modern world is we've institutionalized these three poisons, right? I think our economic system is institutionalized greed. If greed means you never have enough, well, isn't that a perfect description for consumers who never consume enough, but also corporations that are never profitable enough, or their stock price is never high enough, or their market share is never big enough, or nationally, the GDP, GNP is never big enough, right? This need to keep growing. But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? And we can go on from there. We can look at institutionalized ill will, aggression. Well, I'm speaking to you from the United States. Incredible militarism, right? Measured economically, the United States is the most militarized society in human history in terms of the amount of money that we actually spend on our military. And of course, if you spend that much money on the military, you've got to keep finding wars. You've got to keep finding enemies and fighting wars periodically to justify it and so forth. And I think we've institutionalized delusion, especially with the media insofar, at least in the United States, where almost all the media are private corporations. The point there isn't simply fake news, like we talk about with Trump, but rather, you know, media corporations are there to make money, and they make money not by educating or informing us. They make money by finding ways to grab our eyeballs and sell them to the highest bidder. That is to say, advertising, reinforcing consumerism, you see. In all these ways, I think we really need to be considering how have we institutionalized the three poisons that the Buddha spoke about. We have to look at social dukkha, institutional dukkha, and that requires us to go beyond preoccupation with our own individual meditation, our own individual awakening, and look how it is that we are parts of wider interdependent webs. I'm reminded of something the Brazilian Archbishop Dom Helder Camara said famously. He said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." I wonder if there's a Buddhist version of that, right? When Buddhists help homeless people and prison inmates, then we're called bodhisattvas, right? Buddhist saints. But when Buddhists ask, why are there so many homeless? Why in the richest country in the history of the world are so many children in schools homeless? Then other Buddhists sometimes call, oh, that's politics. Don't mix up politics. You know, that's leftist radicalism or something. That has nothing to do with Buddhism. Is that really true? Can Buddhism, can the mindfulness movement just ignore this social dimension and become preoccupied with our own individual transformation? Okay. Eco-Dharma, socially engaged Buddhism, both of those are certainly at the top of the iceberg, which we can see. But I want to talk about another part of that visible iceberg, and this enables me to connect it with the other concern of this talk, the mindfulness movement, which has, of course, become extraordinarily successful in the last decades, right? I think many of you already know that within the Buddhist community, however, it's quite controversial. Something that I really don't want to get into. I'm not going to delve into that, except to point out the simple fact that although mindfulness practices can be very beneficial, they can also sometimes have the effect of discouraging critical reflection on the institutional sources of dukkha that I was just talking about, social dukkha. Bhikkhu Bodhi actually made the same point about Buddhism. He said, quote, "Without a sharp social critique, Buddhist practices could easily be used to justify and stabilize the status quo, becoming a reinforcement of consumer capitalism." Buddhist practices could easily be used to justify the status quo, reinforcing consumer capitalism, especially, say, in the corporate world. In other words, I think the danger here is that Buddhism and mindfulness can be used, and sometimes are used, to support and to kind of normalize the problem that I was speaking about earlier with the first iceberg, right? Very interesting contrast, though, if you think about socially engaged Buddhism, which is, you know, still quite small, to be honest, and then the explosive, huge success of the mindfulness movement. It's an interesting kind of contrast there. But what that does then is make me want to do the same thing as before, to look, okay, what's below the surface? What's less visible that's maybe supporting this relative lack of interest in social engagement, huh? I think if we look below this iceberg, the submerged part, I think it can help us understand why things have developed in the way that they have. So let me talk about the second iceberg, this submerged part, right? Some years ago, I read a book by an academic named Loyal Rue, quite a good book called Everybody's Story about Evolution and so forth. But I came across in that book a passage that literally stopped me in my tracks. It shocked me because it expressed so clearly something that was making me uncomfortable about the Buddhist tradition. And frankly, I think a lot of that applies to the mindfulness movement as well. Basically, what Loyal Rue said is that he believes religions like Buddhism and Christianity, actually in the future, they're going to become less influential, not more, because they basically don't have what it takes in order to address the fundamental problems of our time. And because they don't have what it takes, in other words, they're not really able to address the challenges that I started out talking about. And in particular, he cited two basic problems, which I think are really two sides of the same problem. On the one hand, what he called cosmological dualism, don't worry, I'll explain it pretty quickly, and also individual salvation. And he says both of these encourage indifference toward the kind of social and ecological problems we have today. Right? Very interesting. Cosmological dualism, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of obvious in something like Christianity, right? I mean, in a way, for conventional Christianity, or the way it's usually understood at least, this world is, the importance of this world is kind of as a training ground in order to qualify for an eternity somewhere else, hopefully with God in heaven, right? So there's kind of a contrast between this world. Again, notice this world only has instrumental value. I'm not saying this is all of Christianity, but I think it's most of it, let's be honest. This world has instrumental value because the important thing is where I'm going to spend eternity, right? Insofar as God in heaven is the really important thing, inevitably that involves inevitably, right, some devaluation of this world. Likewise in Buddhism, if you go back to the early texts, there's a strong distinction made between nirvana, the place where the Buddha dwells, and this world of samsara, this world of suffering, craving, delusion, and so forth, right? And in both cases, the emphasis is, for the most part, not wholly in the case of Buddhism, but the emphasis, okay, there's this higher reality, and the point is to achieve it, individual salvation, individual liberation, which involves escaping this lower world, right, qualifying, doing what's necessary to qualify for the higher one, whether that's eternity in heaven with God or attaining nirvana. Now, having said that, I think that the Buddhist tradition is a lot more complex. There's a tension between that dualism that I just talked about, but also, especially in Mahayana, there's a lot of talk about the goal not really being to escape this world, but that is understood more metaphorically, that we need to realize the true nature of this world and the true nature of ourselves. But if you look at sort of Asian Buddhism, you know, even in Mahayana, most East Asian Buddhists, the kind of Mahayana that they believe in is Pure Land. The idea that when you die, Amida Buddha will appear and take you to his Pure Land. Again, it's very much this idea of there's another higher reality, higher than this one, and the goal is somehow to attain it. In Buddhism, we also have the idea of the Bodhisattva path, for sure. But fundamentally, there's the understanding that ultimately my well-being, my Buddhahood is separate from yours, right? Sure, I hope you'll go to heaven. Sure, I hope you're going to get enlightened. But in a way, ultimately, it seems to come back to my own liberation. And maybe in the mindfulness movement too, we can ask my own mindful way of being in the world, separate from whether or not other people are mindful. I think you can see the point here. If you really believe in that kind of dualism, this higher reality, why should we get so focused on improving this world, whether socially or ecologically, right? We should be preoccupied with doing whatever is necessary to transcend it, to escape it. Now, this is not my understanding of Buddhism, as I'm going to explain in a moment, but it's pretty traditional, it's pretty common. Right? Now, in contrast to this, of course, many modern Buddhists, educated Buddhists, don't necessarily accept this kind of cosmological dualism. Look, science hasn't discovered anything that seems to correspond to that. And so maybe it's not surprising that rather than understanding Buddhism as in an otherworldly way, qualifying for some other reality, there has been a really important shift in Western Buddhism toward a this worldly alternative. That is to say, understanding the Buddhist path as a program of psychological development to help us with our personal problems, especially our monkey mind and our afflictive emotions. And this has actually led to some really interesting new forms of psychotherapy, right? As well as, of course, the success of the mindfulness movement. you could say that Buddhism has provided new perspectives on the nature of psychological well-being and what we have to do, how we can promote that. Notice, however, that the basic presupposition of this more secular Buddhism, and I think the mindfulness movement to a pretty good degree, is that the problem with my life is the way my mind works. And then, therefore, naturally, the solution is to transform the way my mind works so that I can fit in better, so that I can serve my roles better. So I'm a better worker, I'm a better spouse, I'm a better parent, I'm a better friend, and so forth, so that I fit into the world better, right? But notice the pattern here. Usually Asian Buddhism emphasizes ending rebirth by somehow transcending this unsatisfactory world with the belief that this world can't really be transformed, right? In contrast, modern, more secular Buddhism and the mindfulness movement, I think, emphasizes much more harmonizing with this world, fitting into it. But in both cases, whether the idea is to escape or to harmonize, neither is concerned about transforming this world. Both, for the most part, tend to take it for granted, and in that sense, seem to accept it as it is, right? Neither approach encourages what I would call eco-dharma or other types of social engagement. And in fact, I think we can specify a particular kind of Buddhist solution to the ecological crisis. And again, those of you who are mindfulness practitioners, you can determine, does this apply to mindfulness as well? I think there's a particular kind of spiritual solution to the ecological and other social issues, right? What do I mean by that? Well, we get up in the morning, we read the paper or read the websites, and usually there's something pretty shocking going on. We're quite inured now to reading horrible news about what's happening ecologically. It seems to be getting so much worse, so much more quickly than anyone anticipated, right? Hey, but wait a minute, we are meditation practitioners, whether Buddhists or mindfulness, right? That means we know how to deal with the anxiety that arises when we read these articles, when we're confronted with what's actually happening, right? I've been meditating for a long time. I know what to do. I go cross my legs. I go face the wall. I meditate for half an hour or so. And guess what? My unease about what's happening in the world, it goes away. I've been able to let it go. My solution to the ecological crisis. Thinking about it, becoming aware of all these issues, it creates concern, worry, dukkha. Hey, let it go. Let it go. For a while, anyway. In that sense, I think both classical ways of understanding Buddhism, like a lot of other religious traditions, and the more modern way of understanding Buddhism in a this-worldly fashion, and again, I think to a large extent mindfulness, both of them can have the same effect of encouraging us to deal with our anxiety about this world by pushing it away. Here's my basic point, is that this ambivalence about what Buddhism calls the nature of awakening, it's a challenge that we can't continue to evade. I think we really need to clarify what the essential message of Buddhism is, and I would encourage those in the mindfulness movement to also ask themselves the same question in relation to the kind of crucial, challenging, critical, ecological, and social situation that we now find ourselves in. Right? What is the essential message here that avoids escapism or simply trying to harmonize and fit in with a situation that's often very painful? What is that essential message? So let me conclude my talk by trying to say something about it. And I'd like to begin by sharing something from an American novelist named David Foster Wallace, because I think he points to this so well. I mean, this to me, this is from a convention. This is a talk he gave at a college commencement. And I think it's pure Dharma, whether you want to call it Buddhist or mindful or anything else. But I think he really puts his finger on something really, really important. Huh? This is what he says. I'm reading from the end of it. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. No such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice you get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexuality, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally bury you. We know this stuff already. It's the skeleton of every great story, but the trick is keeping this truth up front in our daily consciousness. Worship power. You will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will always feel stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. Look, the sneaky things about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it's that they are unconscious. They are default settings, the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And the world won't discourage you from that, because the world of men and money and power hums along quite nicely on the fuel of fear and contempt and frustration and craving and the worship of self. Our own present culture has harnessed these forces in ways that have yielded extraordinary wealth and comfort and personal freedom for some of us. The freedom to be lords of our own little kingdoms. That kind of freedom has much to recommend it, but there are many different types of freedom, and the kind that is most precious you won't hear much talked about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline and effort and being able truly to care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in lots of little unsexy ways every day. This is real freedom. The alternative is unconsciousness, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. It's about simple awareness, awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us. And he concludes, it's unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive day in and day out. My question for both Buddhism and the mindfulness movement: how well are we doing? Is this the kind of mindfulness, is this the kind of awareness that we are promoting? What David Foster Wallace presents in terms of worship, sometimes I talk about it in terms of lack projects. That's the word that I use. What I mean by that is, Buddhism makes this point that our sense of self, our sense of the separate self, is really a kind of construct. It doesn't have any separate reality from the rest of the world. And one of the implications of that as I express it, is that this sense of self, separate self that we all have to some degree, it's inherently uncomfortable. There's a kind of anxiety or dis-ease built into it. As I would say, a sense of lack. By lack, I mean this feeling that we all have that something is wrong with us, something is missing, something isn't quite right, that I'm not good enough. And in fact, I think this is one of the great secrets, the open secrets, that in fact, we think it's our own private problem. And in fact, everyone else has exactly the same problem. Everyone has the same sense of lack, but they understand it and they experience it and respond to it in different ways. And here's the point. What David Foster Wallace was talking about in terms of worship, I call these lack projects, right? Maybe we think only, oh, if I just get enough money, right? Society says getting lots and lots of money is really important. If I just get enough money, then I'll be okay. The irony, of course, is that looking outside, thinking that what I lack is something outside myself, that's just a symptom of this fundamental sense of dissatisfaction, this sense of emptiness or lack inside. And this means, therefore, that it doesn't matter how much money you ever get, it'll never be enough to fill up this bottomless core of your being. And the same thing, whether you understand your lack project is to become famous, or to get a partner, or to get a perfect partner, or to have lots of power, all of these lack projects are diluted insofar as we're looking outside ourselves, thinking that the fundamental solution to the basic problem that I've got is getting enough of this out there. And this, you know, again, money, consumer toys, sexual conquests, power, and so forth, fame. And it's so sad to see the way that, frankly, the way our societies work. That's what you can see most people are preoccupied with. And of course, it's really essential. I mean, what am I saying? From a Buddhist perspective, because the Buddhist path and a path of meditation and mindfulness can help us get in touch with the core of the problem, it can help us free ourselves from these things that we worship, as David Foster Wallace says, or these lack projects, and they can make us genuinely free, in which case, as he said, along with that freedom is the realization of our interconnectedness with everyone else, the realization that my well-being isn't separate from your well-being, and therefore embodying that realization involves a different way of being in the world. That's generous, that's kind, that's loving, that embodies this insight into how we actually relate to other people and to the ecology of the planet. So David Foster Wallace talks about it in terms of things we worship, and I talk about it in terms of lack projects, but I think it's fundamentally the same thing. We become preoccupied with all of these things outside us, trying to stabilize, trying to secure something at the core of our being that cannot be secured in that fashion. Because David isn't something inside here, behind the eyes, inside the ears, right? David is one of the ways that all of this is manifesting. And it's important for David and everyone else, all of us, to realize that, therefore, we're not separate. Whether we're talking about Buddhism or mindfulness, then, it's not about escaping this world or simply harmonizing, right? Individually, if we follow on what David Foster Wallace and I just said, we need to transform the relationship between ourselves and the world. But as we start to wake up individually, realize we're not separate from each other or from this wondrous earth, we also begin to realize that all the ways we live together and the ways that we relate to the earth, these too need to be reconstructed, need to be transformed, which means in these days, not just social engagement as service on a one-to-one level, but looking for ways to address the problematical political, social, economic structures, what I've called the institutionalized forms of greed, ill will, and delusion that are deeply implicated at the root of the eco-crisis. In other words, this realization ultimately, and I think this is the growing tip of spiritual traditions, everywhere. This realization that the path of personal transformation and the path of social transformation, that these two paths are not really separate from each other. Is that also true for the mindfulness movement? Where does that fit in? To say it again, to conclude, the really important question for those of us who practice Buddhism and for those of us who practice mindfulness, does our practice really promote, really encourage these kinds of transformation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for your clear and, as far as I'm concerned, very inspiring words, but also words that ask this question that you ended with. How, as practitioners of Buddhism or mindfulness, how do we deal with the more structural political, social, and economic problems in the world, and how can we stay away from either the escapism or the harmonizing tendencies that we encounter in whatever tradition we are in, and that goes even broader than only Buddhism or mindfulness, but also is visible, as you said, in the Christian world or in the Islamic world. Literally, my maybe if I take that freedom as a host, where do we start? Should we go and stop sitting on the cushion? What kind of practices that address these more structural problems are you envisioning? And I know you're also an active member of the Extinction Rebellion movement, and that's one example, of course. But what kind of practices would you expect from Buddhist or mindfulness practitioners? Mm-hmm. And well, after that, I would be glad to open the floor to all other people attending this talk this evening to ask their question. But that's the thing, that the burning question that came up with me listening to your talk.
Mm-hmm. So, the natural question, right? Yes. No, I think that's important. And I think it's important to realize the sense in which Buddhism can help us, but also the sense in which Buddhism, for example, can't give us the answer, right? Remembering, I mean, the Buddha lived in what, Iron Age India, 2,400 years ago. The kinds of problems we have today, both ecological and also economic, the kinds of institutions we have, there's no real relationship. It's like the Buddhist teachings did not develop in response or in relationship to these problems. So, and likewise, even all of the other Asian Buddhist traditions are all pre-modern. So it's unrealistic to expect specifics, right? The Buddhist texts are not going to tell me whether I should join Extinction Rebellion or not, right? But, you know, I think the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer is what's usually called the Bodhisattva path, right? Or maybe nowadays we'll call it the new Bodhisattva path, or even the Eco-Sattva path. Because what's really important about it is the emphasis that the Bodhisattva has a double practice. They continue to work on their own awakening and also work for the well-being of others. So they see that you can't separate the two. What do I mean by that? You know, back in the days when I lived in, say, the Maui Zendo in Hawaii, and I was practicing, it actually wasn't that difficult. You know, we were doing a lot of sitting, and, you know, there would be occasionally insights, openings, and so forth. In some ways, they weren't that difficult. To be frank, it was more difficult to integrate the kind of things that I was beginning to realize with how I actually lived in the world. Just because we have some little moment of insight doesn't mean that our deep-rooted, mostly habitual ways of thinking and feeling, acting disappear. I mean, my point here is I think what we're moving toward is the realization that whereas before a lot of Buddhists tended to think real practice is when you're on your cushion and any engagement is a distraction from it. And I think we're learning more now that engagement in the world is just as important a part of our spiritual practice as anything that goes on the cushion. But in terms of specifics, I don't think Buddhism helps us. We have to use our own judgment. I'm Extinction Rebellion. I have a friend who's a retired banker. He goes and lobbies Congress for a carbon tax. Other people are good at helping us reduce our carbon footprint. But there's one basic principle that I think is absolutely essential, and maybe it's only really available to those who have a kind of spiritual practice. That is to say, whatever we do, although we try to be as strategic as possible, nonetheless, we need to act without attachment to the results of our actions, which sounds really weird, and it encourages a kind of, it can encourage, if it's misunderstood, a kind of sort of casual attitude. But I think, in fact, I think it's very different. I think what's called for is we have to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do is going to make any difference whatsoever. Really hard to do unless you're grounded in some kind of spiritual practice, you know. And the important point here is that it's not about optimism or it's about hope. Those are dualistic ways of thinking. If you're motivated by hope, you're going to be shadowed or haunted by despair. Rather, bodhisattvas, ecosattvas do what they do. It's their gift to the earth, right? And like a real gift isn't simply, you know, a real gift, you don't give something because you're expecting something in return. A real gift is given freely. And I think our activity to help heal the earth, to help heal our relationship with the earth, this needs to be given freely. I don't know if anything I do makes any difference whatsoever. That's okay. I don't know if anything I do is going to be important, but I know that it's important for me to do it. In terms of specifics, what we pick, I don't think Buddhism can help us. I think, though, it can give us the attitude with which we pursue whatever it is we decide. Sorry for that long reply, but it's your fault because you asked a really very sophisticated and tough question.
That's right. Well, there are coming up some more questions in the chat line, and of course, one of the elements that it's pointed to by Michiel is the interconnectedness or the wholeness of things. But there's another element that is interesting also. Would it be possible, and it's a question asked by Manu Buschots, you were talking about institutionalized dukkha. Is it also possible to institutionalize Buddhist principles that embody wisdom or wholesomeness at an organizational level? Because in of course, on a long-term sense, institutions, in a sense, provide a kind of security, inflexibility. They support us in many ways, like social security provisions or the justice system in many ways, if it works well. So how do you look at that, those possibilities?
Not talking about institutionalized dukkha, but the institutionalized causes of dukkha, right? So I was talking about the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion. And so this question is about the opposite. What's the opposite of greed? Well, generosity. You know, what's the opposite of ill will and aggression? Well, a kind of basic loving kindness, we could say. What's the opposite of delusion? It would be a kind of wisdom that emphasizes our interconnectedness. And yes, I think there's some obvious examples. And I think Britain has, Europe, not so much Britain, but the rest of Europe, I think, has done pretty well in some ways. I mentioned in my talk, we don't have a national healthcare system. You know,
Mhm.
we
Yeah.
have a national healthcare industry. The point of an industry is not to make people healthy, it's to make money. So one obvious example would be a genuine national healthcare system. I see that as institutionalized generosity. I would also suggest something that some Nordic countries have been experimenting with, national income, guaranteed national income. That would be wonderful, so that people have a certain amount that they're not going to be out on the street if they can't get a job. So I think those are two classic examples. Given the kinds of challenges we face today, it seems absurd that we're so preoccupied with spending enormous amounts of money in our military to defend from each other. Why don't we get together and convert large amounts of that military, not just to a peacekeeping force, but also to a healing the earth force,
Mhm.
an eco force, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are two classic examples. I think that those are possibilities, yeah.
Yeah. So one other question that's coming up is from Marjorie. What actually what is the real value of mindfulness practices, both in the mindfulness movement and in Buddhism, in as a means for collective transformation? Because those awareness practices, you could say, where do they help in the collective part?
Well, remembering that as long as we have the deep-rooted delusion of a separate self, you know, to a large extent, we're going to be preoccupied with the well-being of that separate self, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, my well-being is separate from yours. So, you know, the idea, for example, in Zen, the goal is to forget yourself. The goal is to let go of yourself by letting go of all the thoughts and feelings and such that arise when you're meditating, so you can realize your non-separation from the rest of the world. And if you can do that, then you will naturally want to work for the well-being of the whole, right? There's this wonderful Indian teacher, Nisargadatta, who put it better than anyone else I know when he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." Whoa, those are the two foundations of Buddhism, right?
Mhm.
Wisdom and love, or as we say, wisdom and compassion. And it shows us the connection, right? Love or compassion, it's not just a feeling, it's a different way of being in the world that embodies the realization that we're not separate from the world. How do you live in the world when you realize you are part of everyone and part of everything else? And that's, you know, that's the love, and that's the concern for encouraging a kind of social transformation that will work for the well-being of everyone.
Yeah, great. Another question is, what exactly could be the role of Buddhism in climate adaptation? Maybe even also connected to that, does the current crisis we're in offers also an opportunity to expose or bring more to clarity the threats of an ecological crisis?
Um, Not sure I understand the question. Could you
I can,
repeat it?
how, first of all, how do you see the role of Buddhism in climate adaptation? Where
Right.
can it be helpful or not?
Okay. Well, I've already talked a little bit about the Bodhisattva path.
Mm-hmm.
I think this new understanding of Buddhism that understands our engagement in the world is just as much a part of our own personal transformation as actually what's going on in the cushions, right? That our engagement in the world is how we transform our sense of self change our habits, our deep-rooted ways that are usually self-centered. But no, let's get out there, let's engage. And in the process, we become a different kind of person. I think what's really important also in the Zen world, in the Zen peacemaker world especially, we talk a lot about don't know mind.
Mm-hmm.
And usually in the day-to-day world before the coronavirus, the problem in our world is we do know mind. The world seems kind of just going to go on, and it's going to be a matter of making money and, all of these lack projects, all of these things that we worship, like David Foster Wallace. And one of the wonderful things about the pandemic, if we can talk about that, is, it stopped a lot of that in the sense that we're suddenly those kinds of games that we're so preoccupied with. In the case of Buddhism, we encourage don't know mind, whereas in most contexts, don't know mind is kind of paralyzing. We don't know what's possible. But as a result, at least, of Buddhist practice, and I would think certainly parts of mindfulness, types of mindfulness too, it encourages us to be open and flexible and responsive. One of the important Buddhist principles, one of the important stories, two basic Zen stories, I'll tell them very quickly because they're very short. One of them, right? What's the constant activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? That is, what is it that awakened people are doing all the time? And the answer, very simple, responding appropriately, right? By letting go of our predispositions. I know the way the world is. I know the way the world should be and all this. Being here and now, being present in the way that David Foster Wallace was talking about. We can do that. The second story, also brief. Let's see, am I already forgetting it? Yeah, the student asked the master, when difficult times come, how should we respond? And the master says, welcome. Our path is not about avoiding difficult times. Okay, there's a lot of things about the coronavirus we don't want to welcome, but nonetheless, given that it's here, the interesting thing is the difficult times are often the times that are best for our own transformation. They're the things that challenge us the most to actually open up and shake us free from our habitual ways of acting and thinking. And so this great challenge, this great situation, is painful as it is for so many of us in so many ways. It's also a wonderful spur to deepen our practice and to wake up.
Yeah, thank you. One more, we have a few more questions, and it's almost 9 o'clock, but I would like to ask the audience's permission to go on for another five minutes, if you're okay with that, David.
Yeah, that's fine, sure.
Okay. There's one more interesting question from Pepijn, who is a member of Extinction Rebellion here in the Netherlands. And he asked, how can we help to raise this awareness within the Buddhist tradition and mindfulness movement? So from the perspective of being an active member of Extinction Rebellion, how can we help to bring this awareness to the Buddhist and mindfulness movement? So
well, I think that actually, let me not speak about the mindfulness movement. I think that you know a lot more about that than I do, Weibo. But in terms of Buddhism, I think this is starting to happen, okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, I complained in the middle of my talk about it's a lot slower than one would hope, but I think it's finally happening. Maybe it's simply because, let's be honest, things are so bad that it's just getting really difficult to ignore them. And in fact, there's more stress now maybe in trying to ignore them than actually trying to address them in some way, right? But so, I mean, it works from both sides. I've spent a lot of my time and energy over the last years talking to Buddhists and Buddhist groups about why it's important for your own practice to engage, to become socially engaged. But it also works the other way around. I know how difficult it is to be a social activist, whether that's social justice or ecological. how difficult it is to avoid exhaustion, anger, burnout, frustration. And that's why it's just as important for Extinction Rebellion people and other activists to see the value of grounding their activism in some kind of contemplative practice. Because if you can do that, then you can attain what I was talking about, this ability to do the very, very best you can without attachment to results, right? Doing everything you can, not knowing if anything is ever going to make any difference. And that's okay. It's not only okay, that's the energy of my life, that it to give a gift. And so interestingly, some of the people in Extinction Rebellion here in Colorado, they know that I'm a Buddhist teacher. So we actually had a retreat for Extinction Rebellion people up at our Eco-Dharma Center last summer. And I think they found it very valuable. So I think each needs the other. I think it's both personally and collectively. I think we're really seeing more and more in so many different ways how personal transformation, social transformation, how they really need each other.
Yeah. And then one more interesting question from Dieter in Germany. He says, for me, it's also a real challenge to be in this kind of a movement like Extinction Rebellion, because, and that's probably for all, the same case for all social activists, also in those type of organizations or movement, you have sometimes, well, very bad organizational cultures and people dealing not very well or wholesome with each other. How would you say we need to deal with that? And that probably also is not only the case on a collective level, but also sometimes on a personal level, as Daniela from the Netherlands asked. If I want to talk with somebody about, for instance, not eating meat, sometimes people do the opposite, and I'm left with the feeling, well, I had better not talked about it with them. So how do we deal with the difficulties we encounter when starting to be more open in our social activism?
Here with XR, we've not only, like most places, we sort of closed down largely because of the pandemic, very limited what we can do. But also, unfortunately, in the last several months, there's been this big split at the national level, right? Between those who want to incorporate social justice concerns and those who think it, and so yet again, you have this progressive movement that's sort of self-defeating itself by splitting and fighting against each other, right? I mean, this, I think, is where Buddhist practice and Buddhist principles can become very happy, very helpful. One of the, well, happy is fine too, right? I think that one of the teachings that really stands out for me from the early Buddhist text is the Buddha compared his Dharma to a raft that we use to ferry across the river of life and death to get to this other shore. And when you get to the other shore, you don't pick it up on your back and say, oh, this has been a great raft, I'm going to carry it around everywhere. He said, no, the raft is there to help you do something. Buddhist teachings aren't sacred. They're not revealed scripture. They're like roadmaps or guidebooks to help you do something. And so built into Buddhism is this kind of non-ideological. It's important not to become caught up in thinking that what's really essential is to have the perfect social analysis. I mean, that's one really important thing that I think can help. The other thing is, for Buddhism, the world isn't divided into good versus evil people, right? It's more delusion versus wisdom, or ignorance versus awakening. And what this really means is, as we begin to practice and wake up, we get more in touch with, you could call it, the Buddha nature of each person, and to appreciate, everyone has their own dukkha, everyone has their own suffering. So even when people are being nasty, especially nasty toward us, it's our problem only if we engage with it on that level. But we also hopefully through practice, through Buddhist practice, we develop the wisdom to appreciate that, you know, people are suffering and this is a sign of their delusion, not to take it personally. I mean, in other words, what I'm saying, I think Buddhism encourages a kind of psychological acuity so that we're not going to get caught up in the kind of interpersonal, you know, my opinion versus your opinion, and the kind of emotions that get caught up in that. And that's not to say it's always an easy thing to do, but I think that's pretty deep in Buddhism. Yeah.
Yeah. Then final question that well relates to this what you just said, in general terms of your critique on Buddhism. It sounds like the question is from Femke Marx. It sounds more that is a critique on the current institutionalized forms of Buddhism than on its original inspiration as from the Buddha Dharma. Is that right?
It depends on how we understand original. Look,
Yeah.
when I go back to the Pali Canon, it seems to me the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the institution that formed after he died. You see it most clearly with women.
Yeah.
You know, he created a women's Sangha. But the reality is, you know, because he realized women have the same potential to awaken. And by the way, today, every time I give a talk or a workshop, like today, I notice it's at least 2/3, if not 3/4 women, right? This feminization of Buddhism, it's quite amazing, quite fascinating. But nonetheless, after the Buddha died, what happened to the institution? Well, the Bhikkhuni Sangha of nuns, monastics, they more or less disappeared. And my guess is they didn't have enough institutional support from the men, and I suspect the men didn't like the competition. It's something like that. In any case, Buddhist institutions, as they developed, became patriarchal, despite the Buddha's example. Buddhist institutions, you know, Buddha, if you go back to the teachings, the Buddha, his critique of caste, when you join the order, you lose caste. And not only that, he understood, it's clear in some of the sutras, that, you know, the whole caste system is like a social construction. And yet, Buddhism, as it develops, falls back into that. It doesn't challenge kings. It ends up using the karma teaching to rationalize their power. They must have good karma from a past lifetime. So I see, as usual, this tension between the great insight of the founder and the way that the institution pretty quickly, it might preserve a lot of it, but it also distorts it. And so I think our challenge today is to recuperate the best that we see in the tradition in a way that will help us most be able to address the kind of situation we find ourselves in now.
Right. I think it's time to honor our time commitments that we set out at the beginning and in our announcements. David, I would really want to thank you for this wonderful talk and your answers on all the questions that have been asked. You gave us something to think about, to ponder about, the question of how, as Buddhist or mindfulness practitioners, will we engage with the social world? I find personally your perspective very inspiring to start thinking about it and to rethinking the way we use mindfulness in this world, not as an individual harmonizing with it, nor as an escapism to a next life, but by being in this world. And what I find so interesting personally is that what I personally learned from being a mindfulness and Buddhist practitioner is to look and to observe in a very open way and to be aware of what is happening without putting a concept on it or without a first judgment right away, and to try to be open to what is happening around us in relationship to all other people and to the natural world around us, and try to think about how we have to interact and deal and relate to that. And I think that's the core of your invitation to to become an eco-sattva or an eco-dharma practitioner. So again, thank you very much. And
thank you, Weibo, for the invitation. And
yeah,
I'm still hoping sometime maybe may yet become possible to visit in person. We'll see.
I am sure. I'm sure it will. I would also like to thank all the participants for being here tonight and listen so closely to David's talk. And I hope you all feel inspired by that. As we have said on our website and in the confirmation email you all have got. David is giving this talk on a dana basis, the Buddhist way of giving free talks, maybe you could think about, giving a donation afterwards. You could do that either on David's website, davidloy.org, or on the website of the Center for Mindfulness. So we could also thank David in a little other way. Thank you so much for being here. I will put the donation links in the chat line so you can see them. And I hope we indeed will be able to encounter David next year live in Amsterdam for the Eco-Dharma workshop.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again, David. And
thank you all, and may we all work together. There's plenty for all of us to do, yes? Be well, stay safe. I think the earth is calling all of us to become bodhisattvas, eco-sattvas. So let's open up to that call and find our own way of responding. Goodbye.
Goodbye.